I now call the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer.
EU steel tariff threat, a Brexit disaster for Starmer. If you're not subscribed yet, now would be the time. We're cutting through the noise on British politics while everyone else is still pretending everything's fine. Hit that button, because what I'm about to tell you is exactly why you need to stay informed. Right, let's get straight to it. The United Kingdom steel industry is staring down the barrel of what insiders are calling the biggest crisis in its history. And the weapon being aimed at us? A 50% tariff courtesy of our friends in Brussels. Yes, you heard that correctly. 50%. Not a modest increase, not a gentle nudge, but a trade barrier so massive it could obliterate what's left of British steel manufacturing. And here's a delicious irony. This comes mere months after Sir Keir Starmer spent considerable political capital attempting to cozy up to the European Union, making concessions on youth migration and fishing rights, essentially rolling out the red carpet for closer ties. How's that working out for you, Prime Minister? Let's examine what's actually happening here, because the details are rather more devastating than the headlines suggest. The European Union is preparing to implement a tariff structure that would slap a 50% levy on all steel imports from outside the bloc once they exceed a quota level that was set back in 2013. Let that sink in for a moment. A quota from 2013. The world has changed rather substantially since then, wouldn't you say? But Brussels, in its infinite wisdom, has decided that a 12-year-old benchmark is perfectly suitable for today's market. The stated purpose is to prevent cheap Asian steel from flooding European markets, which sounds reasonable until you realize that British steel is being thrown into the same category as cut-price imports from countries with vastly different labor standards and production costs. Now, here's where it gets particularly painful for the United Kingdom. 78% of our steel exports currently go to the European Union. Let me repeat that, 78%. We're not talking about a minor trading partner here. We're talking about the lifeblood of an industry that employs tens of thousands of British workers, supports entire communities, and underpins critical infrastructure projects across the country. And Brussels knows this. They absolutely know this. Which raises a rather uncomfortable question. Is this really about Asian steel, or is this about reminding Britain exactly what leaving the European Union costs? The timing is exquisite, in the most brutal sense of the word. This threat emerges just months after President Donald Trump imposed 25% tariffs on UK steel exports to the United States. So let's do the mathematics, shall we? British steel manufacturers are already contending with American tariffs that have made their products significantly less competitive across the Atlantic. They are struggling with energy costs that are among the highest in the industrial world. They are being forced to invest billions in the transition to greener production processes, which is absolutely necessary for the planet but devastating for short-term competitiveness. And now, just as they are trying to navigate all of that, the European Union decide to potentially shut the door on their largest market. It's not just a perfect storm, it's a deliberately engineered catastrophe. Industry insiders are not mincing words here. One source told the Financial Times that this risks being Trump on steroids. Think about that phrasing for a moment. The American tariffs were already considered a body blow to the sector. This would be exponentially worse. We're talking about existential damage. We're talking about the potential collapse of an industry that has been part of Britain's industrial backbone for generations. Steel isn't just another commodity. It's strategic infrastructure. It's national security. You cannot build ships, railways, or critical defense equipment without a domestic steel industry. And yet here we are, watching it being systematically dismantled by trade policy. Lisa Coulson, Chief Commercial Officer of British Steel, stated that the company is deeply concerned by reports that the European Commission is considering significant reductions to steel safeguard quotas. In typical British understatement, she noted that such measures would risk shutting British producers out of our largest export market at a time when the sector is already contending with 25% tariffs in the United States. Risk shutting them out. That's putting it mildly. This isn't a risk. This is a near certainty if these tariffs proceed as planned. The European Union isn't leaving much room for interpretation here. And what's Sir Keir Starmer's response to all of this? The government has promised to publish a steel strategy later this year. Later this year. Not immediately. Not urgently. Later. When exactly? October? November? December? By which point, the damage may already be irreversible. The government has committed up to £3.5 billion of investment to rebuild the industry and is exploring stronger trade measures to protect UK steel producers from unfair behaviours. That sounds impressive until you realize that £3.5 billion is a fraction of what the industry needs, and exploring trade measures isn't the same as implementing them. It's classic government speak for we're thinking about it. Let's talk about what this means politically, because that's where it gets truly fascinating. Back in May, Starmer made significant concessions to Brussels on youth migration and fishing rights. The political calculation was obvious: soften the edges of Brexit, demonstrate that Labour could achieve what the Conservatives couldn't, and pave the way for a more constructive relationship with the European Union. It was supposed to be smart diplomacy. It was supposed to show that Britain could be pragmatic and flexible. And how has Brussels responded? By preparing to devastate a critical British industry. It's not just a slap in the face. It's a masterclass in how not to conduct international relations. The European Union is essentially demonstrating that it doesn't matter how many concessions Britain makes. The fundamental dynamic hasn't changed. Brussels wants to make an example of the United Kingdom. It wants to ensure that Brexit is seen as a costly mistake, not a viable path for other member states considering their options. And British steel workers are the collateral damage in that political calculation. Their jobs, their communities, their livelihood are being sacrificed on the altar of European Union trade policy, designed not primarily to protect European steel, but to remind Britain of its place in the post-Brexit order. What's particularly galling is the hypocrisy embedded in all of this. The European Union constantly lectures the world about fair trade, open markets, and international cooperation. And yet here it is, preparing to implement protectionist measures that would make even the most ardent nationalists blush. A 50% tariff isn't trade policy, it's economic warfare. It's not about leveling the playing field. It's about tilting it so severely that British steel becomes uncompetitive in its own historical market. And they are doing it while simultaneously negotiating with Britain on other issues, maintaining the pretense of partnership while preparing to pull the rug out from under a critical industry. The shift from the existing 25% tariff to a potential 50% levy requires approval from a weighted majority of member states and the European Parliament. That's the process. That's how Brussels operates. But let's be realistic about what that means. The European Commission doesn't float proposals like this unless it's reasonably confident they'll pass. Member states are already concerned about their own steel industries, their own manufacturing bases. Voting for tariffs that protect European steel while hammering a competitor outside the bloc? That's an easy sell in Paris, Berlin, and Rome. Britain has no seat at the table, no vote, no veto. We're entirely dependent on the goodwill of countries that have their own interests to protect and limited incentive to prioritize British concerns. This is a reality of post-Brexit Britain that the Leave campaign never fully articulated and the Remain campaign predicted but couldn't prove until now. We're a mid-sized economy trying to navigate between larger blocs, vulnerable to policy decisions made in Washington and Brussels, with limited leverage to protect our own industries. That doesn't mean Brexit was necessarily wrong, but it does mean that the cheerful promises of frictionless trade and enhanced sovereignty were, shall we say, optimistic. Sovereignty means making your own decisions, yes, but it also means living with the consequences when other countries make decisions that harm your interests. The UK government's commitment to rebuild the industry sounds admirable until you examine the details. £3.5 billion sounds like serious money, and it is, but spread across an entire industry over multiple years while contending with tariffs from both the United States and the European Union, it's not nearly enough. And exploring stronger trade measures is bureaucratic language, for we haven't actually decided what to do yet. The government is being reactive, not proactive. It's responding to crises as they emerge rather than anticipating and preventing them. That's not strategy, that's crisis management. And let's address the elephant in the room. What exactly did Starmer's concessions on youth migration and fishing achieve? At the time, they were presented as pragmatic compromises that would improve relations with Brussels and potentially unlock economic benefits for Britain. And perhaps, in some marginal ways, they have. But if the price of those concessions is a destruction of British steel, was it worth it? Did we gain more in diplomatic goodwill than we're about to lose in industrial capacity? The answer, increasingly, appears to be no. Brussels took the concessions and is proceeding with policies that serve European interests regardless. British steel workers deserve better than this. They deserve a government that fights for their industry with the same ferocity that Brussels fights for European interests. They deserve trade policy that recognizes steel isn't just another commodity, but a strategic asset. They deserve political leaders who understand that industrial policy isn't about spreadsheets and economic models. It's about communities, livelihoods, and national capability. And they deserve honesty about what's happening here. This isn't just market forces at work. This isn't just the inevitable decline of heavy industry in a post-industrial economy. This is deliberate policy implemented by the European Union, facilitated by British weakness, resulting in the potential devastation of an industry that has been central to British economic life for centuries. The question now is what Britain does next. Does Starmer push back forcefully against Brussels, potentially jeopardizing other aspects of the UK-EU relationship? Does he prioritize steel workers over diplomatic niceties? does he implement retaliatory measures, knowing that Britain is a smaller economy and has less room to maneuver? Or does he accept this as a price of doing business with the European Union post-Brexit, quietly let the industry wither, and hope that £3.5 billion in government support provides enough political cover? The answer will tell us a great deal about what kind of Prime Minister Starmer actually is and what kind of country Britain intends to be. So here we are. British Steel facing a 50% tariff from its largest market, having already been hit with 25% tariffs from the United States, struggling with high energy costs and expensive green transitions, and receiving promises of future strategies from a government that seems perpetually one step behind events. It's not just a crisis, it's a policy failure of the first order. And the workers in Port Talbot, Scunthorpe, and every other steel town across Britain are the ones who will pay the price while politicians in Westminster and bureaucrats in Brussels continue their games of economic chess with other people's livelihoods. This is British Connors, cutting through the spin and telling you what's actually happening in UK politics. If you found this valuable, subscribe because we're not stopping, and neither should you. The stories that matter don't always make the front pages, but they're the ones that actually change your life. We'll be here, making sure you see them. Now you know what's really going on with British Steel and the European Union's latest move. The question is, what are you going to do about it?